To catch up on exactly what's going on, I've been working on a 1992 3000 GT, the pretty nice sports car that came from Mitsubishi back then. To sum it up, I blew through the engine twice, and that was just from failed components inside the engine, not necessarily by overtaxing it. I decided to get rid of that engine and go with something that has a higher chance of success with the least chance of me screwing it up. The stock engine was the 6G72. It was Mitsubishi's workhorse-like engine that was used in everything from the Pajero to even being handed off to Dodge for usage in their vehicles. The issue I have with it is a dual overhead cam design. It requires belt-based timing, and if you skip any of that, you've just scrambled the engine. You've bent the valves, you've screwed up the guides. It's all sorts of just bad news. So in order to get around that as a phenomenon, you could easily delete the entire overhead cam design system. The go-to for swapping out, vehicles that have a larger engine bay is generically the LS platform here in America. There's many positive reasons why you would want to do that. The aftermarket support is nuts. The engine is extremely strong in all of its different configurations, and it's just more rugged to survive a lot of conditions, and because it's push rod based, for me that means that it's better for stability. So long as you don't bend the rods and you don't really have any kind of issues up in the valve assembly, it's much more reliable, and it's a completely enclosed system, so it should be inert to any sort of outside phenomenon like a rock falling into the timing belt of your GT engine. I did not want to do that. Everyone does LS swaps. There's nothing special about it. It's cool when people see it under the hood, but it does not get people to truly stop and stare. I was a little bummed out that I was going to have to go that route, but it wasn't until I started looking on Marketplace did I discover that there is an engine that's a step above. This introduces the GM8100. It is an 8.1 liter version of the 454. For my intents and purposes, this was absolutely ringing every bell for me. This gave me the reliable architecture that comes with the LS system, but it's scaled up, which is purely for the cool factor. To give a little bit of summary on exactly what this engine was used for, it was used in a lot of Chevy big vehicles back in the early to mid 2000s, between the GMC 3500, the Silverado, the Suburban, the Express, the Avalanche, what was called the Kodiak, and the Top Kick. It was found in some U-Hauls. It was even found in what was called the Workhouse Class A motorhome, and the T-98 combat armored vehicle as well, and in some Malibu boats and Mastercraft boats. This engine was designed to perform with power and specifically torque, but also be incredibly reliable in conditions where it simply cannot fail. I've even heard of some reports of individuals taking these things well over 500,000 miles between rebuilds. So upon finding an individual off a Marketplace actually selling one of these things, you bet your ass I immediately slapped a trailer onto my tiny Mitsubishi Mirage and made for the border. I don't even want to talk about the mayhem of just trying to drive that thing back, given the fact that the engine itself and its dry weight was around 700 pounds, and that car is absolutely not designed to do that ever. For those of you who actually are worried about how that went, it's not that bad. I took back roads and made sure to get nowhere near anyone the whole trip all the way back home. The biggest problem about actually getting it back home was getting it off the trailer in the first place. It was really weird and kind of probably I shouldn't have done it the way that I did, being that I was completely alone with no one to give me any help. But I ended up having to sneak the trailer back up to the engine hoist, connect it, and let it cantilever off and pull the trailer out from underneath. It was extremely anxiety prone, but it eventually got the job done. It isn't until moments like these, when you see something of this size dangling in front of you, do you finally start to understand the scale of what you're trying to do. The gentleman that I actually purchased the engine from said that he had pulled it out of his truck because he was implanting a diesel engine into it for his own personal reasons. Now, to put that in perspective, this wasn't just a guy deciding he wanted a diesel truck and then went the route of replacing the engine. He actually had a monster truck. It was a rather sizable thing I wish I would have gotten a photo of, but that's what this engine originally came out of. He had assured me that it was in extremely good condition, that it just had mileage on it, but it didn't have any hint that anything else was wrong with it. But even with that being the case, and because of my past issues with reliability in an engine, I decided that I was going to have to tear this entire thing all the way down to bones, inspect every square inch of it in the proper way, and then rebuild it with all new fresh consumables. And to his credit, it actually was very well managed, with no signs of any kind of issues. The bearings themselves had slight rub, but it's the kind of rub you would find in something that has 6-digit miles on it, so it wasn't that big of a deal. To be honest, it actually took about a year or plus before I actually started to rebuild this engine after the initial teardown, which isn't that big of a deal. I wanted to get the block in possession so that I can use it to map it to the engine bay to figure out all the little intricacies of what needs to change where and when to allow for something like this. Just to remind you, the original 3000 GT uses a transverse engine with the transmission mated to it inside the engine bay, where in this case I'm actually using the V8 platform in regular positioning with the transmission going into what at the time was a non-existent tunnel. I did note very early on that the position for the engine mounts on this block are not symmetrical side to side, but the Mustang Gen 2 front end that I built underneath of it is symmetrical, so I had to shift one of the engine mount locations. I'm not sure what the original reason why this engine couldn't have symmetrical mounts on either side, but my conversion plate allowed me to bolt the plate itself to the engine while the engine mount bolted offset on the plate. I'm pretty confident with the design of the relocation plate like this, and hopefully it'll work out because this is the plate that is going to have a lot of yanking forces from torque twist. The actual engine mounts on the vehicle side was a little bit more improvised, but I think with the thickness of metal and the dual positioning of where the mount is going to help not only hold the engine very firm, but reinforce the frame as well. The amount of back and forth that existed with actually pulling the block in and out of the engine bay for test fitting over and over again was quite ridiculous. And yes, I did have a lot of focus while I was doing it, but apparently at some point in time I had realized that my tilt mechanism on my hoist was accidentally not properly installed together, and I've been hanging all of this weight off of one tiny little bolt for this entire time. In the end, I managed to get everything properly fitted. The main constraint was the positioning for the oil pan in relation to the cross member underneath. But with that being said, I was able to trace the rear firewall, cut out the excess necessary, and then do a dry fit with just the block and the transmission as well. The rebuild process was pretty simple, matter of just following the mechanical service manual that I managed to get a hold of. Thank you, Work, for letting me steal toner. Anytime that I assemble anything, I try to think of the ways that it could go wrong. And one of the aspects that I know about for engines is that they are very susceptible to the tiniest amount of debris. So knowing that the cam bearings on these kind of engines has to be pressed in, I opted to do that step first to ensure that any scrapings that happen due to bearing change isn't left over in the engine's finished components. One of the first problems that we ran into, and this was a complete oversight on my behalf, but the crankshaft main cap bolts are torqued to yield. Now, I don't recall ever dealing with that problem when I had reassembled the GT engine. I might be forgetting about that. But these bolts are almost impossible to find. In fact, I cannot locate any torque to yield bolts for this engine in manufacture to this day. All the common ones like Rock Auto or eBay, nothing. The only thing that managed to crop up from tons of research was ARP. Now, if you know cars, ARP is a very expensive, it's like holding gold in your hand. These parts are the end of the line when it comes to needing the highest performing components you can possibly imagine. Checking with online forums, I managed to come across the same exact thing. Everyone talks about using ARP. No one knows about anything of torque to yield bolts that you can buy nowadays. So I had to go the route of ARP main cap bolts, which is totally fine because even after finding the price tag on ARP's website, it's like $400 for them, and it ended up costing us about $270 from eBay for this, which is sort of nuts when you think about that this is just a handful of bolts, but hey, it gets the job done. Even though I know that this engine did not experience any sort of failure mode at all and saw no signs of that when disassembling it, I still used plastic gauge to make sure that the gap set in between the bearing journal and the bearing material was the exact amount. And with that, we eventually had a rotating assembly. After that, we wanted to make sure that the end gap on the piston rings was proper, and checking quite a few of them gave us the certainty that they were all pretty good. Then came assembling all the rings in their proper configuration on each of the 8 pistons. This engine has what I consider to be a minor limitation of its design, is that 2 pistons share a common journal on the crankshaft. I don't necessarily like that design, but if it works well for them, then it works just fine. With that being said, these pistons do have mating pairs. Not necessarily that 2 of them have to go together no matter what, but that 4 of them face one direction, 4 of them face the other direction, and they have to be installed on the journal in the right configuration. I put together a quick diagram just showing what that means, but basically at the very left and very right side of the journal surface, there's a bit of a chamfer there that the bearing material from the connecting rod will not touch. That means that the inside surface of the connecting rod, the bearing looks like it's shifted slightly to one side, so it's not symmetrical. According to this diagram that I put together here, and this is the exact way that I installed it, you want the journals on the connecting rod to be as close to each other as possible, so that way that the bearing material is not overlapping into that chamfer area on the side. Basically just match them up to this configuration here and you're good to go. And that also keeps in mind that the face of the piston itself should have an arrow or some sort of indicator that is always going to be facing towards the front of the engine. I suggest just laying out all of the pistons in their matching pairs before you even start assembly, that way you don't have to worry about it. Inserting the pistons into the engine is pretty easy to do with a piston compressor. Mine was kind of problematic in that it tried to get sucked in between the piston and the bore, but that was just my particular issue. But at this stage, before you actually push it all the way in, this is where I personally indexed all the rings 120 degrees offset from each other. I'm not entirely sure how super critical it is for how accurate that needs to be, but it's something that's always talked about in rebuild guides, so that's just something we did for all of them. There's something incredibly satisfying about seeing the rotating assembly and seeing those pistons moving around. And for anyone who wants to nitpick, yes, we definitely oiled the hell out of all of the sleeves and components and definitely used assembly grease throughout all the process beginning to end for this, so it's fine to dry run this by hand. Our rebuild kit came with timing gear replacement parts, and I was a little hesitant about pulling off the smaller timing sprocket off the front of the crankshaft, just because it's one of those things I wasn't entirely sure how we're going to do all this properly, but with my puller, it did pop off pretty easily. Had actually very little resistance to it. It was the act of actually driving on the new sprocket that was a little more difficult, and we looked around for piping and stuff like that, maybe a giant socket or whatnot, but hilariously, I ended up just running upstairs and grabbing one of these paperweights that I have that was just this giant nut and used that to twist on everything, and it ended up working perfectly. The main sprocket for the timing gear assembly was actually a little rough. The rebuild kit that this one came with had a lot of burrs around some of those inner slotted hole areas. I took the time to actually take a file and gently smooth all those out. Not because it's going to catch on anything in the engine, I just don't want any condition to where it breaks on its own, like a tiny fleck or something, and it's just sloshing around in the engine. So I think it's important that anytime you grab any parts for a rebuild process, you inspect them for that exact reason. Nothing new that comes out of a box is guaranteed to be in perfect condition. Coming from the 3000 GT and trying to set the timing with that timing belt, This was so incredibly nice. A hell of a refreshing bit of engineering that all you need to do is just match the dots from the camshaft and crankshaft sprocket to each other. Basically, one's at 6 o'clock, one's at 12 o'clock. They meet very closely. Make sure that that's maintained when you put the chain on there. Bam, there's your timing. You're good to go. For some reason, at this point, my oil bottle behind me just decided to start draining all over the table with no reason at all. Don't even know why, just nobody was around.
Did that motherfucker really just stop?
Yeah, that motherfucker really just stopped.
And somehow I have 0 video.
Wow, okay. That was just running. Just draining.
Are you...
This. Fuck. Now that the exorcism and bad puns are out of the way, next was the timing cover with its new gasket. After that was a fresh oil pump, which surprisingly needed no type of gasket in between it and the block itself. This is where I want to say that I think the manual got something wrong. After the pump is installed, it says that you need to fill the pump and then cycle the engine to get the pump to articulate some of the oil down through the systems. But the problem is that we haven't reached a step where we actually engaged the camshaft to the oil pump itself. This is one of those things that when you start cranking on the crankshaft, because of the timing chain, it turns the camshaft. And then the camshaft, all the way down on the very end, has a bevel gear that engages with a drive mechanism. That drive mechanism turns the rod that goes up to the oil pump. So unless you put that drive mechanism in, that can't be achieved at all. So this is kind of a warning to watch out for that. It won't damage anything, but you're just going to be spinning the crankshaft with no oil going anywhere at all. So if that happens to you, this is why. One of the features that came with this engine was having the ability for the oil to exit the engine through a oil cooler system and back into the engine again. I don't believe that's going to be a necessary thing for my purposes. With that in mind, I attached a redirect to feed the block in on itself. I think that should be good enough because basically the oil was only ever meant to leave the engine and then go back into the engine. So if I end up finding out later down the line that the engine could do, in my application, to have a cooler, I can easily add that later on. Due to the nature of how the engine mounts had to be relocated on one side, it now clips into the position of where the dipstick used to go. So in order to remedy that, I need to relocate the dipstick. This presents an interesting project that I will be covering as I go along with this build of relocating a dipstick that you can also tune the dipstick's little threshold of where it shows the oil by the location of the tank itself. I'll show that as it goes on, but that requires modifying the oil pan a little bit, which is something that I wanted to do on the current one that I have. Unfortunately, but also fortunately at the same time, we found a crack in the bottom of this pan. It looks like it may have hit something at some point in time, or rather something came up and hit it, but it did fracture it all the way through from the backside to the front side. This is going to require a totally new tank, which on the bright side looks better. In the next video, we'll be showing off the rebuild process for the heads and the pushrod related hardware. It's actually coming together very nicely. There wasn't too many problems, and it went together a lot faster than you would imagine. Lastly, I was at an antique mall the other day and managed to come across one of these stickers, so yeah, you absolutely know I'm going to be rocking that on the back of this thing. Thanks again for watching this video. Hope you catch the next one.